Many settlers of the American West gave up their lives for a new start in the wilderness for adventure, entrepreneurial spirit, and greed. Ethnic and religious repression caused the Europeans and Americans to move west for freedom.
Many land speculators who bought land illegally from Indians drew settlers west, promising rich and fertile farmland. Many people who moved west begged family and friends to join them in the wilderness. People also moved west because the population was growing and they wanted more space. Others did not like how rapidly the east was industrializing, so settlers moved west and set up their own cottage industries.
Push factors were conditions settlers faced causing them to move westward. Pull factors were government incentives to get settlers to move westward. Many new groups of settlers were joining mainly white Easterners. German immigrants arrived with their customs and the Lutheran religion. Before settlers came to the Great Plains, Native Americans had been affected by changes which blended with and altered traditions. In the 1800s, Indians hunted buffalo, which were the main source of meat, hides for shelter, clothing, and even wealth. Indians hunted while on horses and traded goods with French and American traders for guns. There was peace between Native Americans and settlers for a time, until the settlers discovered that further west had a bunch of hidden resources. The battle for western land began. Settlers and Native Americans had different views of land and other resources. The Native Americans saw settlers as invaders. The government tried to restrict the Native Americans by making treaties. The government was dishonest and began using violence to force the tribes to sign the treaties.
Left independence, April 2, 1846. The order given was to start with 250 wagons. Each captain had to furnish 4 men from his company to stand guard at night, the company that was in the rear at night having to take the lead next morning. But we soon found this plan would not do, for it made it too late getting into camp. So we concluded that it would be best for each company to be independent and yet keep as near together as possible.
In 1873, there was a treaty violation which resulted in violence from both sides. The U.S. Army stayed along the south so they could monitor the reconstruction. The soldiers on the frontier had to get the settlers out of reservations, stop gunfights and liquor smuggling, protect certain groups of people, and sometimes fight the Indians. They faced difficult living conditions with the chance of getting smallpox, cholera, and the flu. The Native American soldiers battled. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 ended with Colonel John Chivington's army killing 150 to 500 people, whom were mostly women and children. The Battle of Little Bighorn of 1876, which is also known as Custer's Last Stand, forced the Sioux back to reservations. The battle started because the Sioux resisted white expansion, which caused them to be angered by the government building a road through Sioux hunting grounds. The 2-year war began trying to stop them from building the road. When the war stopped, there was the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. After the government snuck into their territory, trying to buy the land was a failure, they sent Colonel George Custer to the Indians. This resulted in the Sioux killing Custer and his soldiers. Around the 1890s, a ritual called the Ghost Dance came around. The Indian police officers tried to arrest Sitting Bull, who was encouraging this ghost dance. After shots were fired, the 200 Sioux were killed. Many white Americans wanted Native Americans gone, but some started a peace movement instead. Most reformers thought Native Americans should lose their culture and adopt white traditions. In 1879, Richard Pratt opened a school called the U.S. Indian Training and Industrial School. Many children were forced or tricked into learning and developing the white culture.
The government wanted to change the traditions and customs of Native Americans to make American Indian youth civilized. Thousands of Native American children were sent far away to live in these schools to learn white culture. Many died from colds like influenza, tuberculosis, and measles, which spread rapidly through the schools.
common schools are the stomach of the country, in which all people that come to us are assimilated with a generation. When a lion eats an ox, the lion does not become an ox, but the ox becomes a lion. If the Great Spirit had desired me to be a white man, he would have made me so in the first place. He put in your heart certain wishes and plans, and in my heart he put other and different desires. Each man is good in the sight of the Great Spirit. It is not necessary that eagles should be crowns.
Eventually, the Dawes Act came to be. This act divided the reservation land. The Indians were not too happy about their expectations to farm this land, so they sold it. Congress tried to buy Indians' claims to land in the Indian Territory. On April 22, 1889, homesteaders surrounded the territory. Shots were fired to decide who would be taking control of the land. It took many battles, but the U.S. conquered the Native Americans. Along with Custer and Sherman, many miners, ranchers, and farmers descended on the American West from the end of the Civil War to the end of the 19th century. By the late 1800s, the unplowed prairie of the Native Americans had vanished and were now filled with miners. After a discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, California in 1848, many families started moving to California. One of the biggest strikes ever in Nevada's cornstalk lode sent prospectors moving. Over the next 30 years, it would yield $400 million in gold and silver. The Black Hills of Dakota produced $1 billion worth of ore. Miners searched for metal in the soil or stream beds. The easiest tool to use was a shallow pan in which the soil was put in the pan with water. The West soon after had a cattle boom. During this cattle boom was also the destruction of buffalo. The government thought by killing off the buffalo, the Indians would be forced to make room for settlers. Many towns made specifically for cattle were coming up everywhere, but eventually taken over and shipped east. Cowboys drove cattle up the Chisholm Trail. This trail had many connecting routes and led to the Red River. At this river, cowboys had to be aware of Indian raids and sometimes had to pay to get through. The cowboys' jobs required waking up early and long rides. A fifth of the men were Mexican or African American. Those cowboys faced diseases, stampedes, and gunfights.
Once cowboys got the cattle to the depot, they would be paid for their hard work, which would usually be spent immediately, drinking and gambling in the towns. All the cowboys were men, but women also worked hard. Most women could even use a gun, fix anything, and herd cattle or sheep to their pasture.
The cowboys weren't the only people taking care of cattle. The cattle business was growing, so wealthy ranchers made cattle operations. By 1889, around 36 cattle barons controlled over 20 million acres of land. Eventually, the cattle boom ended because of bad weather conditions, overexpansion, declines in prices, and cattle fever. Homesteaders had a difficult life farming on the plains. Once these homesteaders built their home, they plowed the fields. Some homesteaders faced floods, fires, dust storms, and drought, which caused all their hard work to be ruined. They also had to deal with many insects, including insects that carried diseases that would affect the people and animals. Because of these conditions, many homesteaders left for the east. Some families stayed, though, continuing work as usual. The men did most of the hard labor, like plowing, planting, and homesteading. When they really needed money, men would work for other people. The women cooked, cleaned, raised children, taught them, and made some resources of their own. As a dry climate came into the West, the farmers had to practice dry farming, which would conserve as much water as they could. Eventually, this all became easier when the new machines were introduced. These inventions included plows that did more work than the previous plows, harrows, and automatic drills. Soon after, in 1875, steam-powered threshers were introduced, and then corn binders in 1890. The farmers also began to educate themselves in new farming techniques. Because of these new machines and techniques, farming boomed. As a result, bonanza farms came to be. These farmers were large businesses that produced huge amounts of cash crops. The supply of crops became higher than the need for them, so prices dropped. The West wasn't all about farming. Around 1880, the people had 7 church denominations to choose from. There were social clubs that included a women's auxiliary focused on charity work. There were clubs for people of all kinds: railroad engineers, teachers, hunters, ranchers, and people interested in all different subjects, including science, literature, and theater. As the population was growing, unorganized areas became U.S. territories. The Yellowstone National Park was established. This was the nation's first national park. In 1890, the frontier was said to have ended by the Census Bureau. This meant free western land was officially over. In 1893, Frederick Turner said the frontier was a key role in developing the American character. He thought frontier life opened up Americans' eyes to adventure, self-improvement, and commitment to democracy. This became known as Turner's thesis. Turner, along with many others, have shared their thoughts on the West, but along with that came many myths. Many of those myths became stereotypes that were shown in movies, songs, and literature. In 1883, William F. Weiss shows were just one of the many examples of this. Stereotypes and myths about the Wild West will always exist. They affected the viewpoints on men and women, with men being seen as seeking freedom and opportunity, and women either taking on the men's strength or they were seen as too soft. It depended on the person themselves to decide how they viewed the Wild West.